Welcome to Shapes of Grief, listeners. I'm joined today by D Anaya, otherwise known on social media as the Adventures of Grief Girl. And Dee is joining me from New Mexico in the United States. Dee, you're really, really welcome.
Greetings. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you reaching out.
Well, Dee is a mom, like many people on the podcast, and is also an artist. And in the last 7 years, Dee has dedicated a lot of her art to creating art installations about grief and different ways of showing grief and expressing grief. What was the loss that you endured, Dee, that led you to bring your art in this direction?
Well, I think that I think my life just kind of led me here. But once I started this project, about 3 years after my daughter died in 2013. I've always been an artist, so I've always kind of just made either visual products or written or photography and things like that. And the idea that I could talk about my grief any way that I wanted to kind of led me to start the adventures. So
back to 2013, Dee, your world stopped. I mean, I acknowledge you've said your whole life was building towards this moment, and I definitely want to go back to earlier.
Oh, yes.
But in this immediate time, 2013, your little girl, Phoebe, who was 4 years old, died in her sleep.
Yep.
Phoebe had a condition. Would you tell
She
us
did.
a bit about that condition, Dee?
Sure. She had recombinant 8, which is a rare disorder that affects the heart, the kidneys, fine motor, gross motor. She was also born deaf, and so we had to learn sign language to communicate with her. And that was also an adventure. Like, you know, she was one of my greatest adventures, honestly. And she taught me just so much about life while she was alive. And now her teachings are a little bit different. So, you know, having that impact, I think, was the heaviest of all the impacts that I've ever had.
Yeah. You said, Dee, that Phoebe, or you told me before I started recording, that Phoebe had been born deaf, had some physical limitations, was born with a cleft palate and a hole in her heart. And while she had all of these different things that came with bearing the recombinant 8 gene, you did not expect her to die. This was
Right.
unexpected.
Right. We did not expect her to die. We were in care. We were doing everything that we were supposed to be doing to keep her alive. And so, you know, we countless appointments, countless providers, specialists, surgeons, and behavioral specialists, and occupational therapists. I mean, we had a full team of people taking care of this really cool little girl. And she was so supported. So, I mean, you know, there was no thought for me that, oh, she's really going to die. I'm doing everything I can do to keep her alive. And so I knew that it was a possibility, but also I knew that we were doing everything we could do. It just happens.
She was out there, she was going to school, she was a happy little girl.
Yeah.
You said she brought so much joy to your lives. And Phoebe died in her sleep one night.
Yeah, she was incredible with how she related to the world. She was deaf, yes, but she had sign language, and she was willing to teach other people sign language so that she could talk to them. And she would make fun of them in her way, and she would just be generous and kind with her time and her patience and her love. And she touched so many people, but also opened a door for us to a community that we wouldn't have otherwise been in. And these people today, to this day, are like family to us. And so, you know, they celebrate her like I celebrate her. Maybe they don't do it every year or whatever, but whenever I celebrate her, they will also remember with us. And so that says a lot to me that she really touched them too,
Did
because
she ever did she ever take advantage of knowing that other people couldn't speak sign language to say a few little things about them, or
no, she really knew because of having a hearing family and then having to be in those two worlds. I knew sign language and her dad learned, and then her brother also learned. And they don't sign as much anymore, but I still use my skills. And so it's like she knew that I would know if she was doing that. And so she didn't really she didn't really do that too much unless she had a little opinion about something. And
so that's
she
one way
was
you're
just
able to maintain the bond with her is through sign
mm-hmm,
other people
mm-hmm.
her language.
Absolutely. It's just the way that I can take her everywhere that I go and use the information that I have from her life to include people that, are not included often.
And say something more about that, Dee, because you alluded to it earlier when you said that working with grief was something that really had been coming for a long time in your life, even before Phoebe was born, um,
Mm-hmm.
even before Phoebe died, that
Mm-hmm.
something you knew something of.
Oh,
Tell me what
absolutely.
you meant.
Well, so I've had so many instances from my aunt committing suicide, from my stepfather getting suddenly ill and dying a few months later, just suddenly out of the blue, watching my mother deal with grief, and then later becoming estranged from my mother, and then now my father dying, and then my grandfather dying, and
Father died just last year, January 4th, 2020.
yes, my father died on the 4th of 2020, and his father died 3 days before I gave birth to my son, so I couldn't go to his funeral. And he was one of my favorite people, and so it just on we go.
Yeah, so that's a lot of loss. And I'm
Mhm.
curious about your relationship with your mother, Dee, and the estrangement, because that is such a profound loss. And it's also a disenfranchised loss. It's one that's not recognized by society. And when we have a falling out either with a family member or indeed a friend, these can
Uh-huh.
be hugely significant losses that aren't marked, noticed, supported, validated.
They really aren't. And in fact, people will assume that you're going to forgive the person depending on the circumstance. And then because again, we're at the impact where it doesn't affect anybody outside of the people who were directly involved. And so it's easier to sweep things under the rug. It's easier to say, well, I have a great relationship with my mother and their family, and you must talk to your mother. And so, the grief of that is very heavy and it's very devastating because she is my mother. And boy, do I need my mother, you know, with the things that I'm going through.
It's a hard one to have people understand, and it's a disenfranchised loss. So you've had one thing after the other for the last few years.
Oh, yeah,
And you also said to me before we were recording that Phoebe's death nearly broke up your marriage as well,
absolutely.
which can happen when a child dies in a house because grief is so individual and so profound, and people don't understand each other, and you're so caught up looking after your own little corner of the world because it feels like it's falling apart, that often we can't show up for each other, and that can
Right.
be another really profound loss in the whole
Mhm.
grieving process. Here
Yes.
I am grieving and my partner isn't there beside me because they're in their corner of grief.
Yes.
Are you willing to speak
And
about
and oh, absolutely. And they feel the same way. Like, my partner is not here for me, because the experience is not the same. Even though we're experiencing the same loss, like this is a loss that we share. He does not share all of my other loss, and I don't share all of his other loss and all of his trauma. And what's tricky about that is even getting a man to realize that they have been traumatized and they behave in a certain way because of that trauma. That's a miracle in and of itself. Because I get it, because I don't want to have things wrong with me. And I'm not necessarily saying these are things that are wrong with you. It's some things you maybe want to pay attention to because of how it's affecting what we're doing right now, which is, trying to keep our family together. And so, and like, I know that my outbursts really affect everybody in the house. And I know that. So I try to work on that. And I try to, that's my work. That's my work to work on. It's not everybody else's work.
Yeah. And equally, the person who withdraws in the house has an effect on everybody else as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of, he wasn't talking about his grief out loud. It wasn't, and it was just part of his upbringing and what he was taught that is the proper emotional response to everything.
Yeah. It's
so
societal, and it's also grieving styles, right? Whether you're an intuitive griever, which is mostly emotional, or an instrumental griever, which is usually fix it. And the instrumental grievers do not understand the intuitive grievers. And the intuitive grievers do not understand the instrumental grievers. That can cause war, right?
Absolutely. And that's exactly it. And you have to know that. And I don't mean like guess at it. You have to know it. And that has to be the thought that you reach for before you respond. I know that there is something very different about what we're doing. How can we show up for each other? So like we can't grab onto that blame the spouse for this, blame the other spouse for that. We cannot reach for that, because I can make a whole list of things that I'm disgruntled about, but they're nothing in comparison, in the grand scheme of things. It's nothing.
And I think, when a child dies and the pain is so profound, the grief is so profound, it's so much easier to be angry with your husband or your wife than it is to feel the pain of the loss.
Absolutely.
You're nodding furiously there, Dee. What have you?
Yes, yes, I am. Because that's it. It's nobody wants to be in that much pain all by themselves. And that's what it is. You're in that much pain all by yourself. And really, nobody knows how to fix that, because it's never not going to be a thing. It is concrete. It's not, I lost my job and the pain of that will go away. I'll get a new job. I might be happier at this new job. It's not the same thing. And because death is very concrete. Death of the flesh is so concrete. It's so concrete. And that, I think, is the hard thing for people to grasp, is that this is a concrete pain. This is not a pain that's going to be different when I get a new job, when I'm distracted from, whatever it is I'm doing.
Or have a new baby.
Or have a new baby.
What do people respond?
Oh, you have a new baby, you have new problems. You have new problems on top of old problems. And so, it's...
Talk about that a little bit, Dee. What sort of things you heard when you had your third child, who was born after Phoebe died, right?
And truly, she's my fourth. prior to having Phoebe, we had a loss a year and a half before. So we would have 4 children. And so even having Phoebe was an event because I was devastated. Devastated. When I say I was devastated, I mean, like I could have been a year straight that I didn't talk to anyone. And then Phoebe came along, and then, you know, the events went along as they did. But this last one, Stella Bell, she's she was also an adventure. And she would have probably been a thing whether we had Phoebe die or not. So it the it was never about her being a replacement or this child being a replacement for her sister. So I heard a lot of commentary about you know, oh, you'll feel better because look what you did, you have another baby. And you know, and that's, I don't get that. That is the craziest thing because you don't replace people. You don't. Each person has a significant effect, like, and it's theirs, and it's not about replacement. It's not about, here you have this baby, now you can stop hurting about the one that you lost because you have another one.
There will never be another Phoebe.
There will never be another Phoebe. There will never be another Pierce or another Stella Bell. There will never be another. And, you know, the grief of, I didn't want her to be seen as the replacement either. The grief of, I really was like, oh my God, you know, in the back of my mind, I hope it's a boy because I know the things that people tend to say about girls. And so I'm like, oh my God, you know,
And did
what
they
do I
say those
do?
things, Dee?
And inevitably they came. Oh, you know, inevitably it was the commentary about you have a boy and a girl now, and you know things are great, and um, I had everything that was specific to Phoebe for me. It, like, the choices that she made about her preferences, all of those things, I don't forget those things. And so in my mind I'm like, oh, I hope she doesn't choose that. I don't want her to, don't do that because you're not a replacement. And so it all stemmed from that commentary that was, you know, alluding to that I could be happy now because it was, you know,
You got your
replacing what you
girl.
lost.
You got your girl. Yeah.
You got your girl.
Yeah. So
And that,
sensitive.
yeah, and that in and of itself is so hurtful. It's so hurtful. And it's one of the very subtle hurts though, because you know, when she grows up, is there going to be a time that she's angry with me about, you know, having, I have to live in my sister's shadow, which, you know, you all weren't the same person. So it's not, and I guarantee you, if you had died, I would have, you know, been feeling the same things and doing the same things. It's not different. This is not different.
You
And
were always going to be born.
mhm,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, you were always going to be born. And so, like,
Mm.
you know,
So
mm,
yeah, I was going to ask you, you know, we talked earlier about your relationship after Phoebe died,
oh
um,
yes,
which mirrors the experience of so many people. How did
hmm,
you find each other again? What do you think was the thing? Was it active work to reconnect? Or do you feel that time just eased it? What happened?
no, it time itself did not ease anything. We have had a lot of support from our friends, and we have had some amazing people who have come into our lives who are doing relationship work. So there were relationship coaches, and I'm very big on the self-help thing. So I have always, you know, believed in being able to find the tools and being able to, you know, try them out and use them and decide whether, oh, is this really what we're doing? You know, the habitual things that we're doing and grabbing onto as our first reaction, is that really conducive to what we're trying to build with each other? So it took us really sitting down together and deciding, is this something we really want to continue doing? It was super hard to say that because we both, I think, felt like we were letting somebody down. But I was also knowing, and I knew that I was in a place where I couldn't do anymore. Like my body was just exhausted, in just my
You
body.
felt, or you felt you were letting him down, and he felt he was letting you down. So
Right,
you questioned each other, is this something we want to continue?
right.
Okay.
Because I couldn't show up in the ways of like the wifely things. It was like I
Sex.
my
Just
my
say,
my whole body, like my whole body was feeling this, and either repressing or detoxing or whatever it's doing, healing basically. um my body is just making decisions on like I'm either going to fall apart mentally or bodily, but I know that it's happening, or it was going to be both. So if we didn't find some answers about what we were doing with our relationship, I knew that I was actually just going to go ahead and go crazy and call it a day,
and
because there was not much else I could do.
and just to name it, because I don't think we've ever talked about sex on the podcast. When you are
Hmm.
two grieving parents, sex can
Hmm.
be an impossibility.
It affects, because grief affects everything. Grief affects your libido. Grief affects your mental state. It affects everything. And then that's on top of the culture that women are just for sex for their husbands. And like, if they're not showing up, then hey, that's they're less of a woman. And like, it's hard to separate yourself from those thoughts and ideals when you were culturally immersed in them your whole life. So it's like, I can't hold this anymore. I can't do this. I can't. I am no longer in a place where I can give and give and give and give and give with zero return. Like, I was not feeling good. Like, I too would like to enjoy my body. I too would like to enjoy you, even. So it was not necessarily something he was doing. It was just that my body needs time to recover from A, having four children, B, all of the stress and internal things that are being released. I need to recover. Like, my mind's tired. Like, it's hard to feel sexy when you can't even, you don't even know what sexy even looks like or feels like
And
anymore.
read a book, never mind pull that out. Yeah.
And exactly, I don't have time to just be a woman and just be by myself. I'm here with these children all the time, all the time.
And people
And
need you, needing parts of you, and your
mhm,
grief needing parts of you. And then somebody else coming in and wanting yet another part of you. It's
that
like,
part
oh,
where I never even get to replenish any of the other parts. I just never get to replenish. And so it's like we're running on empty, and we're scraping the bottle of the can now. And there's not anything really left in there for me or for you. And it's not anybody's fault. I'm not blaming anyone. I'm saying I need time. I need space. I need this. And I needed to be able to say those things without feeling like the other person wasn't giving, but it was, this is not something you can do for me. You can't do this part for me. And don't feel inadequate, because it's not you. It's not you. It's not about you. And don't make it about you. And so, like, it's, I feeling inadequate too.
so you said it wasn't time that brought you together, but it was
Uh,
more, looking at each other in the reality of what you'd lost, Phoebe's death, your grief, how it was affecting every part of your lives,
mhm,
and making a conscious decision. Let's try and reconnect. Let's try and meet each other somehow
mhm.
in this.
And through a relationship coach, we that I randomly met,
As you do.
who is amazing, by the way. She was doing some really beautiful work with relationships. And so we committed to doing that kind of work. And we are still doing that kind of work. And we will go more into that when we start the podcast about, we'll do a series about, marital relationship after loss. And it's difficult because you have to keep showing up because those issues just don't lay down and go away.
Yeah,
And
it's not a question of just waiting and hoping. It's being
mhm,
active and
right, because
engaging it.
is a thing. Resentment is a thing. And if you never say or acknowledge that something needs to change and are able to name the thing that needs to change, you still know, even if you don't say anything, you still know it and it still builds up. And we know what happens when we suppress our emotions about a certain thing, whether it's, you know, something benign or something very serious. And like men don't have the space to say a lot of things because it's not macho or it's perceived as weak. And so there was a lot of that going on. And then I felt like I'm going to hurt this guy's feelings if I say everything that I'm thinking. If I say everything that I'm thinking, he's going to think that it's all him, which I wasn't wrong about that. And so, but I had to say them anyway, because what I also knew is that it was going to bother me. I can't take this to the grave because it's going to be an early one and I don't want to do that. It was literally eating me up inside.
So you've survived it both, and you've gone on to have another child who I just met
We
actually.
did a lot of this work after we had that child. So
I want to ask you, Dee, we spoke briefly about this again before we were recording. Grieving as a Black woman is different
oh
to
yes.
grieving as a white woman.
Mm-hmm.
Would
Mm-hmm.
you fill in the blanks here for our listeners about what that means? Because it is so true that, grief can be cumulative.
Mm-hmm.
How we grieve can depend on other losses we've had in our lives, other things that we've gone through. And we know that the Black community have a disproportionate amount of loss
Oh.
compared to the white community. So what are your thoughts around that, Dee?
Well, I absolutely know that I have a lot of compound grief. And so as we talked about, there's been, and even more than I've said. So just knowing that and knowing my counterparts, I know what I'm grieving and they know what they're grieving. And then, their grief gets a lot of attention. It's a lot of support, and it's support in ways they're available. But when I go to look for support and I'm looking for those Black faces, I very rarely see them.
So when you say
So,
your counterparts, do you mean your white counterparts?
yes, I do. And it looks to me like it's the care is available for those who can relate to the white faces, all and we're not always talking about the same type of grief, and like that space to say, well, I'm a Black woman and I'm grieving this and this, and it's taken seriously and we are just listened to and held and supported, and there are other speakers that are of color, and there are other there's the care that is available, and folks who can really relate to the types of grief and the generational traumas, and if you don't have a trauma that is similar to somebody else's, even though you have a trauma, you're still not as informed as this other person, and you cannot relate on these levels. And you may think, oh, well, this shouldn't be that difficult, because you can try to rationalize it, but who does that? who does that? And so,
Maybe, like when you talk about your white counterpart, would this be like at a grief group, for example, that might be
well,
mostly white women, or
mhm.
where do you mean? Give us more information. I really want to understand
So
more.
in online groups, in-person groups, there was a grief facility. There's still a grief facility here in our town. Just the lack of diversity is very blatant. The lack of um, informed providers. We were told that my son couldn't come back to the group session because he didn't want to follow what they were doing there. And while we were there, I saw at least two other children who didn't want to do,
Is this a grief group?
yeah.
And he was told he couldn't come back?
hmm Oh, he's too young. And I'm like, all right, cool. But this is supposed to be a grief group. And so this also led me to be more informed about grieving and more informed about how to coach others and to go and educate myself so that I could fill in that gap,
Yeah, that's awful that that happened.
you know.
There's a
Uh,
woman, I don't know if you've heard of her, Lindsay Whistle Fenton from Speaking Grief.
mhm.
About this woman, Dr. Tashelle Bordera, and I've emailed her. I'm hoping to speak with her. But she talks about exactly what you're describing there with your son, Dee. She's coined a phrase called suffocated grief.
Mhm.
She's noticed this in Black communities, and she will say it so much better than I do. Actually, there's a video where she talks about it on speakinggrief.org.
Okay.
Anybody listening, listen to her, but in case you can't, I will try and do justice to what she's saying. She noticed that in Black communities where there was so much loss and grief, that not only were the children not given the space to grieve, but they were also put down because of their grieving behavior. So we all know that children rarely will sit down and say, I'm sad, I really miss Phoebe. They will come up and tell you you're an asshole or say something inappropriate, or they will throw their dinner on the ground. I mean, that's how grief manifests in children a lot of the time. And so Dr. Tashelle Bordera was seeing that children, such as your son, for example, were being suffocated in their grief. So not only were they not being supported, but they were actually being punished for a lot of the behaviors that they were having while grieving.
But yes, exactly what you're saying. It's that kids in general too, and are suffocated in that way a lot of the times. But in the Black community, like as I grew up, it was, if you don't talk about it, you just don't talk about it, and you go on and you do what you have to do. And I know you're sad, and move on, move on, move on. Don't linger in that pain of whatever it is.
Is it
And
like
so
that expression of this is just the way it is? Let's just get
it's
on with it.
just the way it is. And I find myself saying that um a lot of times in my life, like recently. It's just the way it is. And so the harm that we can do by saying that it's subtle, but it's definitely there. And um I felt really alienated just in general going to this facility because there were no Black people there. It's like we live in a town that, we are the minority here, and so we don't have access to products for our hair. We have to order them, and we just can't. The community's not large enough for a box store to carry what we need, and that seems crazy, but that's just the way it is. It's just the way it is here. And so to go to a facility that's meant to help people, I see them helping people there. And and to be told that the person that was facilitating couldn't manage helping my son, who was 3 years old, that doesn't make any sense to me. And so while it may not have necessarily been about race, I still haven't seen a Black face there. So, you know, it's, is this what your facility does, or is it not what your facility does?
And if you can't accommodate that child in the group because he is too young, find another way to accommodate him. Do
And
a
I,
one-to-one,
and,
show up.
mm-hmm. Well, there were several 3-year-olds there. So, I mean, it's either I don't know what it is. I'm not going to say, oh, specifically, yes, it was just because he was Black. But, this seems to happen far more often to us than the white people that I know.
Yeah.
All the support in the world is right there.
Yeah.
And it's, do you have somebody that's informed of what we're about to be embarking on? Because again, it's generational trauma that we're working with here. It is not just, his sister died. It's, he's living with me, he's living with his father, I'm living with all the things that I've had to deal with in my lifetime and reacting to whatever he's going through with all of that nonsense going on. And so all of it is not conducive to healing. So it's like we need to learn new tools, and these tools weren't available to my parents because we didn't even have access to therapists. So, here in this country, if you're working and you do have full coverage benefits, and it does include behavioral health, we get 12 sessions. And then the 12 sessions runs out, and then they're $150 a session. And then, you know, it gets costly. And these are not things that are going to go away. So I'm probably going to need some therapy.
Yeah.
And
I just feel the isolation of you saying that there aren't a lot of other Black people in your community.
mm-hmm,
Just compounds it all as well.
mm-hmm,
As
mm-hmm,
I'm trying to find one other person who has the similar experience to you, because they
mm-hmm,
have a similar background to you also.
mm-hmm.
And
And I know that, yeah, when I go and say a thing, it's not going to be taken out of context. I know that I'm going to be understood. I know that I'm not going to have to explain. I know that I'm not going to have to explain. I know that I'm not going to have to look over my shoulder and think, or do they think I'm crazy? Because, some
but
very real
it's
things.
easy to feel that way, Dee, because I think grief already, the few people I've met today have spoken about that feeling of going crazy and needing to meet someone else who had a similar experience for them to know that they're not going crazy, or to feel, grateful to have their experience validated. But it's like you need it doubly over. Not only it's not enough just to meet somebody whose child has died and who's gone through a similar experience to you, but for you it's really important to meet that other person who's also lived through systemic racism for their life, and has that behind them as well generationally, because it
Mhm.
does affect, like, everything we go through in our life affects how we grieve.
Yeah.
The attachment styles we have, the relationships we have with our parents, the friendships we've made, the losses we've encountered, the way we feel supported or not in society, all of this affects how we grieve. And I'm delighted that one of my podcast guests, Dr. Mikel Harris, who's
Hmm.
a wonderful psychologist, and she works a lot with children and grief. She's prepared a great lecture for my educational project entitled Black Grief, and she describes this really, really well, how as healthcare professionals, we need to hold the whole picture, not just this one incident. We need to hold the whole picture. Um, Even with LGBT grief, I did a lecture yesterday, and it's, when someone arrives in front of us and this thing has happened in their lives, I need to understand it in the context of everything before, the context of the AIDS crisis. How many people did they lose? Is there survivor guilt? Did they lose their families at some stage? Were they ostracized? Did they have to, like, certainly in Ireland, if you were gay before 1990, you emigrated. Life was not worth
Right.
living staying in this country. Or you were thrown out if you didn't emigrate. Many people lost their families, their communities, their sense of self, their home. So these are all the things that we need to take into account when someone in front of us has lost a same-sex partner.
Yeah.
Then equally, when somebody is Black, we need to take into account all of their life experience, the context in which they live in the world, the traumas they've had, how being Black has affected their experience of life, and then therefore their experience of death.
Absolutely.
Loss as well.
Absolutely. A medical doctor will ask me what my history is before they work on me. That's just a question. Like, they want to know, how many pregnancies have you had? Because this is going to affect what's going to happen next. So, it's not that hard. It's not that hard to say, and it's not an impossible request, but all of this is all tied together in the sense that, in the medical community, there are fewer Black doctors in my area, in the medical, so if I'm looking for a Black doctor, if I'm looking for a Black psychologist, or even an art therapist or a massage therapist for that matter, on down the line, it's the availability, the access is very limited.
Yeah.
And it's always been limited. So before, my mom was able to go to a therapist. Her mother was not able to go to a therapist. So this is recent history. This is not this is not 800 years ago.
When you say not able to go to a therapist, what exactly do you mean?
It means that it wasn't even an option. It was not an offer in the medical community. Hey,
as a Black
here's
woman to access a therapist.
Yes. And so in the Black community now, the advocacy is for Black mental health. It's that it's okay to have to go to therapy. It's okay to say, I need help, and get it. It's okay for Black people to be doctors now, because before that was not okay. It was not okay. And so all of these things in retrospect are working we're working towards that whole thing that you're saying about the disparity and the racism and the systemic oppression, and it's in every aspect of our lives. It's not just because in my Black life, just being Black. It's not just that. It's being a Black doctor, being a Black lawyer, being a Black president, being a Black anything, and each of those things, and the access that we've had to becoming any of those things in the eyes of our country, or in the eyes of the world for that matter. So they're all very much tied together. We can't just look at that little piece and say, well, it's not because you're Black. It's because you're not Black. That's that's what it is. It's because you're not Black that you don't understand that.
Color blindness.
And so I had a therapist here. She was from South America, which was, I felt like, okay, I can connect a little bit. And she was really wonderful. And so, there was that I have to look for a connection, not just a clinical practitioner.
We all do.
Yeah. We all do. That's what we all really should be looking for.
Women want to find another woman because it's like, what's an older cisgendered white heterosexual male
going to tell me about my life?
If I'm a gay Black, it's
right. Yeah.
We need to find someone who resonates with us, and I really get that. I really get that. And I'm sorry that that's been so hard for you, and that your family has struggled to even find grief support.
Well, I'm not one of those people who just takes that one no as the end all and be all to what I can have and what I can do. So, I got on the line and it was a decision. Like, I am going to support myself, and I'm going to find resources for myself that fit for me. And so I did. And it wasn't necessarily traditional therapy. And it wasn't, uh, I'm going to a psychologist's office every single day. Because, at this point, I've been to a lot of psychologist offices, and I'm good on that. I'm good on that. But I do know that people need that. And then they also need the thing that when the talking runs out, what do you do? And that's where my art came in for me. It's like I still have these things that I need to express. The talking does run out. And then that is you either run out of money because you can't afford it. Here in the States, it's like, again, 12 sessions a year. That's one session a month. And if we're not just dealing with one thing, and that might be okay for some people who they're not dealing with the death of a child, or they're not dealing with the death in general, because it's not just the death of a child that's destructive to a family either. um, And so the expectations that we have surrounding grief in our societies, those need to be looked at, and to be, people need to be really honest about what the needs of the people really are. And we can be more informed in how we help each other. And, I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not trying to psychology anybody. I do want to see your art, though. you know I do want to see what you have to say about the pain that's in your heart, or what you're going through mentally, and like, it's going to help somebody else. It's going to affect their life and how they deal with the things that they deal with. So,
And
and we
the key point is it's to find some way of expressing and processing your grief. For you, it was, your art was what helped you ultimately. For others,
hmm
it's their sports. For others, it's their swimming. For
hmm
some, it's their writing. For others, it's therapy. Uh,
whatever it is, and as long as we have access to that, we can't we can't lose. We can't, like, we can't lose if we have access to the thing that makes us feel heard or seen or loved or comforted. And that's ultimately what people really want for bereaved people. But we don't trust enough in whatever their um, comfort might be. We don't trust that we can actually heal ourselves, and we don't trust that. And when I say heal, I don't mean we're going to forget about it and it's never going to hurt again. I mean, it's not going to control us,
yeah.
because so many of us are ruled by our anger and our special needs surrounding certain things, our expectations, our need for control, and all of those things. So it's I think, if I'm able to trust myself, then I'm going to be okay. But if I feel unsteady, I don't feel like I'm going to be okay. I need for people to hear that. I need for people to understand that. And I need for people to actually listen to what I'm saying, rather than assume that they know how to fix it. I know how to fix it. I know. So, and I want other people to know that they also know how to fix it. Not that and not fix in the sense that, again, it's going to never be broken again, or never be dealt with again. It's the ways in which we are able to have access to care for ourselves, because we know best what comforts us. We know best what is going to get us to that next thing. And when we don't know, we have to be able to trust that people will listen to us. And there's a lot of times that, everybody has their idea about what they think would be better, and it's not necessarily better.
And it's just about finding your own way in your own time, and
Mm-hmm.
other people. I'm being waved at here by your little girl.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's listening to other stories and thinking, no, that would never work for me, or maybe I'll try that. But You know, you're right, ultimately people find their own way, make their own meaning, and find their way to express and process their grief, and that's to be honored and applauded.
Yeah, we don't do enough honoring and applauding, and we are so busy wanting people to be done with whatever they're dealing with. But you know, it's a case by case basis. It's a case by case basis. It's not one size fits all. I'm not dealing with what you're dealing with. I don't have answers for you specifically. Here's what I'm doing to help myself, and you're welcome to join me in doing it.
It
And
inspires you great.
yes, if it doesn't, hey, here I have a whole lot of friends who do some really cool things. Maybe one of them will work for you.
Yeah.
But you know, it's not that, oh, if you know, you just need to go to church, or it's not about that a lot of the times, you know. And you know, that's another cultural thing that happens here, is that, you know, the Lord's gonna fix it for me, and I just need to make room for that. But I wasn't raised in that, so
Yeah.
that's not the band-aid that's gonna
And
work for me.
actually, research shows that people who have a faith tend to deal with their grief better because they have a ready-made meaning handed to them. They don't have to look and find their meaning in a lot of cases. But Dee, it's been really nice to meet you finally
Oh,
on Instagram.
yeah,
Um,
it's been lovely.
thanks so much for sharing your experience and for telling me about Phoebe and just what it's been like for you. I really appreciate you showing up today.
Oh, thank you for asking. And I appreciate this. Every opportunity to talk for me is another day that I get to give something back. So
Great. Well, I'm sure this will resonate with lots of people, Dee. So thank you, and we'll talk again.
yes, please. Thank you.